Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining my talk today. Its subject is Approaches to the Analysis of English Medieval Town Plans. This talk arises from research I undertook as part of a PhD thesis at Birmingham University, which I completed at the end of 2020, and it is an update of a presentation I gave to the CBA West Midlands Annual Conference News from the Past in 2021, incorporating additional research which I've undertaken since that time. In my thesis, I used as case studies towns from outside the West Midlands. My methodology, however, is applicable to English medieval towns as a whole, and as this website is devoted to the West Midlands, I've largely substituted examples from this region. An integral part of my thesis was the use of a GIS or Geographic Information System. This is not the place to discuss the use of GIS in detail. I would, however, like to briefly outline some of the advantages of using a Geographic Information System in the study of medieval towns. The GIS software I used was ArcGIS, and this slide shows a ArcGIS workspace, in this case for Frodsham in Cheshire. But we needn't worry here about the details of the town itself. It is the wide range of data which can be created, downloaded, analysed and stored in a single place which it is intended to demonstrate. Hence, if we look on the left-hand side of the slide, we can see the spatial data which I use for the study of Frodsham. At the top we have contour data, which I downloaded and used to create a digital terrain model or DTM. At the bottom, the data which is not ticked is material which I used in the analysis but is not shown live on the current map. This includes historic maps as well as historic environment record data supplied by the County Archaeological Service. In the middle are a series of plan types which I created myself, such as the outline of the medieval town, a manor house and a port area. If we move on to look at the history of the study of the topography of medieval towns, the subject has been the meeting place and on occasions the battleground of researchers in a wide range of disciplines, most particularly historians, geographers and archaeologists. The subject really took off around 60 years ago, at which time practitioners of the three disciplines tended to stay within their own silos without taking too much account of each other's methodologies and findings, although there are some notable exceptions. Archaeology in particular, especially the archaeology of historic periods, was rather looked down upon. Hence the famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, statement of the historian and numismatist Philip Grierson, who wrote in 1959 that the spade cannot lie, but it owes this merit in part to the fact that it cannot speak. More recently, there has been a greater degree of acknowledgement of the value of each other's work across the disciplines, although differences in emphasis do remain. The slightly tongue-in-cheek slide shown here is not in fact a confrontation between archaeologists and historians in the 1960s, but shows a reenactment of the battle between the Saxons and the Vikings at Tamworth, said to have taken place in 874-5, although there is in fact no evidence that it ever did take place. A reminder to be questioning of the sources that you use. My research aimed to identify, test and discuss the approaches most commonly used across the different disciplines. I distinguished four of these: landscape analysis, town plan analysis, documentary evidence and archaeological evidence. I shall look at examples of each of these in turn, explaining what I mean by each term as we go along and picking out some of the more interesting aspects of each. So the first technique is landscape analysis, which for my purposes I've defined as the examination of the wider area surrounding a town, looking for clues as to its origins and development. One aspect which can be identified using this methodology is the relocation of settlements. A good example of this is Bridgnorth in Shropshire, shown here. The early town lies on top of a high sandstone ridge overlooking the River Severn. Bridgnorth grew in a series of stages. It was founded by Robert de Bellem, the 3rd Earl of Shrewsbury, between 1098, when he succeeded to the lands around Bridgnorth on the death of his brother, and 1102, when he lost his English lands after rebelling against Henry I. Robert built a castle here to defend himself against the king. He placed it at the southern end of the sandstone ridge, with a church in its inner bailey, and laid out a small town in the outer bailey. He also constructed a bridge over the river, enabling access to the town and castle from the opposite bank. Subsequently, the town was greatly expanded to the north along the sandstone ridge in a series of planned extensions. So here we see the site of the castle, with the church in its inner bailey, and the site of the original town in its outer bailey. To the east is the bridge over the River Severn, and to the north is the area of the later town. It is the earliest stage of the development of the town of Bridgnorth which concerns us here, however, for in order to ensure his incipient town's success and give it a jump start, Robert moved the inhabitants of the nearby borough of Crockford, founded only 20 years or so earlier by his father Roger de Montgomery, along with its collegiate church, to his new town. The Domesday Book gives us valuable information about the status of the settlement in 1086. Within the entry for the manor of Erdington, held by Roger, we are told that there is a borough called Crockford, rendering nothing. So what does this mean? It is clear that Roger de Montgomery had carved the borough of Crockford out of the territory of the manor of Erdington, most of which lay on the opposite bank of the river. The fact that the borough rendered nothing does not mean that it had no value. It was quite common for a landowner, when founding a town, to give land for settlement tax-free for a number of years in order to encourage incomers. The borough at Crockford lasted only a few decades, however, before Robert de Bellem moved its inhabitants to Bridgnorth. So if we look on the map, we see the site of Crockford around 2 miles downstream of Bridgnorth, with Erdington on the opposite bank of the river. Nowadays, Crockford is little more than a hamlet, with only a few indications of its earlier status. There are some poorly preserved earthworks of a Milton Bailey castle overlooking the River Severn, while a little to the east stands the parish church of St. Mary Magdalene, which is located on the site of Roger's collegiate church. Another phenomenon which can be traced from landscape analysis is the effects of the replacement of a ford across a river by a bridge. Generally, fords were located at the shallowest part of the river, while bridges were positioned at its narrowest point, where it could most easily be spanned. Hence, roads originally leading to a ford were often diverted to approach a newly built bridge. A good example of this is the southern approach to Ludlow, where the Ludford Bridge, shown here, spans the River Team, carrying the road from Hereford over the river. The building of the bridge is traditionally ascribed to Giustadino, who was the Lord of Ludlow around the middle of the 12th century. From the bridge, the road runs up Broad Street to the town's large rectangular marketplace, laid out at the gates of Ludlow Castle. Halfway up Broad Street, it passes through the town walls via Broad Gate. So shown here. These defences were not built until the 13th century, however. So here we see Broad Street, leading up from the bridge to the large rectangular marketplace, with the castle to the west. The marketplace was originally much larger, running as far as the junction with Old Street and Cove Street, but it was gradually infilled and encroached upon. The parish church of St. Lawrence lies on the north side of the marketplace. The bridge, Broad Street, the marketplace and the church all belong to the 12th century. The castle was built in the late 11th century, but reconfigured to face onto the marketplace in the 12th century. This slide is a view from the keep of Ludlow Castle, looking out towards the marketplace. We can see the east gate of the castle, with the marketplace at its gates. At the far end of the marketplace, we can see how it has been infilled with 3 sets of buildings, separated by a central high street, with narrow alleyways at either side. To the left is the tower of the Church of St. Lawrence. This 12th century layout had replaced an earlier configuration. As indicated by the name Ludford for the area to the south, the river had originally been crossed by means of a ford located around 200 metres downstream of the bridge. So in this area here. Once the river was crossed by way of the ford, traffic from the south would have passed up Old Street to the Bull Ring and then down Cove Street. From there the road ran north towards Shrewsbury and Chester along what is now the A49, which follows the line of an ancient routeway. One aspect which puzzled me when I first looked at this early crossing point was that the route from the south showed no sign of having previously headed towards the ford, but instead ran in a straight line towards the later bridge, and the ford could only be reached from this by turning an awkward dogleg. So there's the route from the south heading towards the bridge. If we want to get to the ford, we have to turn this awkward dogleg. Examination of earlier mapping, however, showed that previously there had been 2 routes approaching Ludlow from the south. Hence, if we look on the map to the right, which dates to the early 1830s, we can see not only the road from Hereford, but also a second route coming from Worcester. This route originally led directly to the ford, but when the bridge was built, was diverted to cross the river by this means. So what happened to this earlier route? In 1835, the owner of Ludford House, shown here, changed the route of the road from Worcester to run to the west of his house, along the same route as the road from Hereford, in order to give himself greater privacy. The line of the Worcester Road to the south of Ludford House can still be seen marked as a field boundary. This slide summarises the situation regarding the road layout, with the original line of the road from Worcester shown in blue, and the line of the road from Hereford shown in green, and the section of the road from Worcester diverted after the building of the bridge shown in red. One last observation on the road layout. I had originally assumed that once Ludford Bridge had been built in the 12th century, and the Worcester Road had been diverted to cross the river via the bridge, that the ford went out of use. However, in a document called the Fitzwarren Romance, written in the late 13th century, but covering events in the 12th century, we are told that Giustiniano, when threatened by an army coming up from the south, sent armed men to guard not only the bridge, but also the ford. Indeed, even as late as the 16th century, John Leyland, who visited Ludlow in 1543, was aware of the existence of the ford. Hence it would appear that the ford continued in use even after the building of the bridge. Why was this the case? The area at the top of Old Street, which is now called the Bullring, was previously known as the Beast Market and was the site of Ludlow's medieval livestock market. Hence the most likely explanation is that livestock coming up from the Worcester direction were brought to market via the ford rather than the bridge, which would have meant that they did not cause disruption by passing through the main market area. If we turn now to the second approach, town plan analysis, this comprises a detailed examination of the internal layout of a town. It is primarily a historical geography technique devised by the German émigré M.R.G. Conzen in the 1960s. Conzen emphasised the value of looking not just at the town street plan, but also its historic plot or property boundaries, as shown on early maps, or in some cases as surviving down to the present day. It is easiest to explain his approach by working through an example. This is a detail from an Ordnance Survey map of 1901, showing the small medieval market town of Eccleshall in Staffordshire. I've used this to recreate the town's historic plan form. Here we see my recreation of the historic street plan and property boundaries, digitised from the Ordnance Survey map. Having delineated these, Conzen advocated using them to define plan units representative of different phases of development. The division into plan units, and particularly their dating, is the most hypothetical part of his methodology, unless we have documentary or archaeological evidence to give us more precise dating. It does, however, provide us with a tentative model of development, which can be checked if and when further information is available. I've divided Eccleshall into 4 plan units and suggested possible dates for each of these. Plan Unit 1, to the left of the slide, comprises the area around the parish church of St. Lawrence. Although the earliest work in the present church is 13th century, a priest is recorded here in the Domesday Survey, and there are fragments of Anglo-Saxon cross shafts of 9th to 10th century date rebuilt into the walls of the vestry within the church. The best preserved cross shaft shows a rider on a horse holding a long staff or spear. Below this is a fragment of a further figure, of whom only the head survives. He is holding a cross, indicating perhaps that he is a priest. The evidence suggests that there was a church, or at least a preaching cross, here in the Anglo-Saxon period. And indeed the Eccles element in the place name, derived ultimately from the Latin ecclesia, meaning church, might indicate the presence of an even earlier Christian community in the area. The manor of Eccleshall belonged to the Bishop of Lichfield, who obtained a charter for a Sunday market here in the mid-12th century. Sundays were a popular market day at this period, as attendance at church could be combined with the buying and selling of goods. The market may have been held in the triangular area in front of the church, and possibly within the churchyard itself. The acquisition of a market charter would not necessarily indicate that a market was first established at this time. Possibly informal trading had been taking place for some time, which encouraged the bishops to foster its growth by obtaining a formal charter. Hence we can suggest that Plan Unit 1 dates from some time before the Norman conquest down to the 12th century. Plan Unit 2 is composed of two broad market streets, High Street running east-west, and Newcastle Street / Stafford Street running north-south, with burgage plots fronting onto them. The Bishop of Lichfield obtained a new grant for market here in 1221, this time on a Thursday. By the 13th century, the holding of markets on a Sunday and in churchyards was frowned upon, so this change of market day was perhaps the occasion of the laying out of these formal market streets away from the church, accompanied by typical burgage plots with narrow frontages designed to allow as many properties as possible access to a market frontage. Plan Unit 3 comprises a moated site and its surrounds. Although now under a housing estate, the moated site is shown as an earthwork on the 1901 Ordnance Survey map. This is the site of the Iswell Manor House, built by a steward to the bishop in the 13th century. Given that the burgage plots to its east run the full length of the area between High Street and a back lane to its south, we can suggest that the ones to the west originally did so also, and that the manor house site was carved out of these, indicating that it post-dated the original laying out of the burgage plots. Indeed, small-scale excavation on the moated site in the 1980s, before the building of the housing estate, uncovered a ditch predating the moat, which was interpreted as a boundary ditch between burgage properties. Plan Unit 4 is a small extension of burgage plots on the west side of Newcastle Street, here, likely to represent an expansion of the settled area, but still predating the Black Death and other pestilences of the 14th century, which saw the population of England fall by around 50%. The dating of the plan units must remain tentative, since, in common with the majority of small towns in England, there has been only limited archaeological excavation here. Note also that there is no sign of defences. This is not unusual for small towns. When I carried out the Cheshire Extensive Urban Survey in the 1990s, I didn't find evidence for medieval period defences in any of the Cheshire towns, the only urban centre in the county with evidence for defences being the city of Chester. This photo shows a street market taking place in Eccleshall's main market street, High Street, in 2012. We can see that the street is wide enough for stalls to be set in front of the buildings and still allow plenty of room for people to pass along it. The third approach is the study of documentary material for evidence of urban topography. I've time here to highlight just two particularly fruitful sources. The first is the Domesday Survey of 1086. I've already discussed the Domesday entry for Erdington in Shropshire, which established that a borough had been founded at Quatford by Roger de Montgomery. Another example which is of particular interest, as it gives us a reasonably precise date for piece of town planning, or rather in this case city planning, comes from Hereford. The photo shows the large triangular marketplace at Hightown in Hereford. We can see that it comprises a much larger market area than at Eccleshall, as befits its status as a major administrative and trading centre. So where does this planning episode come in the settlement's development sequence? If we look at the late 19th century Ordnance Survey plan of Hereford, we can see that the marketplace lies immediately outside the northern defences of the late Saxon city. Unusually, our date for the laying out of the marketplace comes not from the Domesday entry for the town itself, but from that for Eton Bishop, a small village around 6 kilometres to its west. We are told that Earl William Fitzosborne, Earl of Hereford, gave it, the manor of Eton Bishop, to Walter, Bishop of Hereford, in exchange for land in which the market is now. So at some point in the 20 years between the Norman conquest in 1066 and the Domesday Survey of 1086, William had swapped his manor at Eton Bishop for the land at Hereford where he laid out his market. We can in fact give a more precise date, as Earl William was killed while on campaign in Flanders in 1071. Thus we can suggest a date of between 1067, when William took control of Hereford, and his death in 1071. It is likely that at the same time Earl William ordered the laying out of a series of burgage-style properties fronting onto the new marketplace. These are best seen on the northern side of the market area. These were granted to newly established French burgesses, who were given preferential terms to encourage them to settle here. The effect of the newly laid out marketplace and burgage plots was to pull the commercial centre away from the late Saxon city. This favouritism to new French settlers is a common phenomenon documented in many Anglo-Saxon towns taken over by the Normans. Another useful source are borough and market charters. We do have to be careful, however. Borough charters do not necessarily date the foundation of a town. Indeed, some towns never received borough charters, although properties were still granted by burgage tenure. Burgage tenure gave the tenants significant rights, principally that they held their land at a fixed money rent, that they were free to pass their properties on to their heirs or to sell or sublet them, and that they were able to buy and sell at the town market without paying tolls. Equally, market charters do not necessarily date the inception of a market. An informal market may have been in operation for some time before it was considered worthwhile going to the expense of obtaining a market charter. And indeed, long-established markets in urban centres might be deemed to be held by prescription, i.e. that they had held a market since before it was necessary to obtain a charter to do so. As I discussed for Eccleshall, the acquisition of a market charter may, however, indicate a period of interest in a town and suggest dates for episodes of town planning. We can illustrate these points in more detail by looking at the case of Wolverhampton, whose marketplace and parish church are shown here in a 19th century view. This slide shows the major episodes of medieval town planning at Wolverhampton, overlaid on the earliest plan of the town, Isaac Taylor's survey of 1750. The earliest settlement here perhaps dates from the late 10th century, when the Mercian noblewoman Wulfran is said to have given land for the foundation, or possibly the refoundation, of a minster church, presumably on the site of the later church of St. Peter, A on the plan here. A richly decorated late Saxon column, which lies adjacent to the church, may commemorate this event. The presence of a Minster church would have attracted ancillary settlement and the growth of a Sunday market for the convenience of churchgoers from the surrounding area. Certainly there was an unofficial market in operation by the late 12th century, as in 1180 the Sheriff of Staffordshire fined the town 20 shillings for the market, which they ought not to have. The market was not suppressed, however, for in 1203 we hear that the market day was changed from Sunday to Wednesday. Hence the fine was seen as a means of raising revenue, rather than as a way of stopping market trading. As discussed earlier, Sunday markets are a sign of an early trading centre and were often held in and around churchyards. But by the 13th century this practice was frowned upon. Hence a change of market day is likely to have been accompanied by a change in location, away from the churchyard and its surrounds. Accordingly, I would suggest that it was at this point that a new market area was created by laying out a broad market street, marked as B on the plan, the present Dudley Street, running down from the church. This street remains the town's main shopping street. Eventually, Wolverhampton's status as a borough and market town was formalised at the instigation of Giles de Erdington, the Dean of Wolverhampton, who obtained a grant for a Wednesday market, presumably a continuation of the existing unofficial one, in 1258, and in 1263 granted his burgesses a borough charter. This phase of interest in the development of the town was perhaps the occasion of the laying out of additional market areas, comprising the large rectangular marketplace, the present Queen Square, at right angles to Dudley Street, marked as C on the plan, and a square off-street Corn Market, D on the plan, in the corner between Dudley Street and Queen Square. I take greater confidence in my suggested date for the Wolverhampton Corn Market by its resemblance to the market area at the Square at Shrewsbury, where the old market hall now stands. This off-street market area was also formerly known as the Corn Market and was created in 1261, around the same time as I am suggesting for the Wolverhampton example. Wolverhampton can also be used to illustrate another example of the value of GIS, the ability to visualize a settlement in 3D. This slide shows Isaac Taylor's 1750 map draped over contour data derived from LiDAR, Airborne Laser Survey. The figure demonstrates vividly the town's character as a hilltop site with St. Peter's Church at its highest point. The market areas of Dudley Street, Queen Square and the Corn Market cluster around the high ground to the south of the church. The prominent moated site to the bottom right of the figure is the Great Hall or Old Hall, built by one of the major Wolverhampton families, the Lucens, on the southern outskirts of the medieval town and the scene of recent excavations. The building of prestigious moated sites on the edge of towns is a common phenomenon in the West Midlands from the 13th century onwards. My fourth approach comprises the use of archaeological evidence, in particular excavation. We've seen that in some cases, such as at Hereford, documentary evidence can give us a reasonably precise date for events recognised by landscape or town plan analysis. More often, however, it is archaeological excavation which, as well as providing data about urban topography in its own right, can give us closer dating for phenomena recognised by the other three techniques, and this ability can only increase as archaeological dating techniques become more refined. One aspect which particularly interested me was the extent to which plot boundaries defined from Victorian mapping could be shown to date back to the medieval period. As we've seen, this is a basic tenet upon which Keynesian-style town plan analysis is based, but this assumption has been little tested. My example comes from Northampton in the East Midlands, as I was anxious to find a test site with a good length of medieval properties set either side of a street, which included trenches across the street itself, an unusual occurrence, except where, as in this case, the street itself was being closed down. This is the site at St. Peter Street in Northampton, excavated by John Williams in the 1970s. This slide shows the excavation of the north side of the street only, but the work was subsequently extended to include the south side of the street and sections across the street also. Here we see, shown in red, the major plot boundaries for the area of the St. Peter Street excavation, as defined from the earliest detailed mapping available, the Ordnance Survey 1 to 500 scale mapping of the 1880s. This slide shows these major plot boundaries overlaid on the excavation plan of the early 15th century phase of the site. The settlement pattern at this time comprised a number of stone-founded buildings set either side of the street. A widespread correspondence can be seen between the Victorian plot boundaries and the 15th century boundaries discovered during the excavations, especially PBs 1, 2 and 3 and 7 and 8. As a corollary, it is worth noting that the properties here are set parallel to the street. Although medieval urban properties are often set at right angles to the street, as we've seen at Hereford and Eccleshall, this is not necessarily the case, especially in areas which, as here, lie away from the main commercial streets. I do not have space here to reproduce all of the phase plans with the Victorian boundaries overlaid, but at least some of the 19th century boundaries can be traced back to the immediate post-conquest late 11th century phase of the site, and St. Peter Street itself can be shown to date back to this period also. If we turn to the excavation plan of the late Saxon phase, however, we can see that there is poor correspondence between features of this date and the Victorian plot boundaries. Hence PB1 cuts through buildings 1 and 2, while PB7 is set at an angle eccentric to building 4. In addition, although there is some metalling present, St. Peter Street has not been laid out at this period, and indeed building 1 lies across its line. The evidence suggests that, as at Hereford, there was a wholesale rearrangement of the urban landscape here in the Norman period. The lack of correspondence between the pre-conquest layout and the Victorian plot boundaries is of particular interest, because elsewhere, most notably in the Coppergate excavations at York, Victorian and later boundaries have been shown to date back to the late Saxon period. We may be seeing here a distinction between major centres such as York and Lincoln, which developed a truly urban character during the 10th century, including buildings set against the street frontage, and other proto-urban centres such as Northampton, which comprised clusters of aristocratic compounds, albeit with some evidence for industrial and commercial activities at this date. We should, however, acknowledge that St. Peter Street was a back street away from late Saxon Northampton's main thoroughfares, where the settlement pattern may have been different. Thank you for listening to my whistle-stop tour of medieval urban topography. I've been able here to do no more than provide a snapshot of my approach to the analysis of the development of medieval towns, but I hope that I've demonstrated the benefits of adopting a holistic approach, including the importance of looking outside the immediate urban envelope and also the extent to which similar patterns of development can be seen across a variety of settlements. If you wish to delve deeper into the subject, my thesis is available for download via the URL shown on this slide. It includes not only my research, but also a discussion with references of other work on the subject.